Hey guys, welcome back to another video. It's part 2 of my series on Proverbs 2. Today we're going to be looking at verses 16 through 22, but focusing especially on 16 through 19, as that is where Solomon, again the author of Proverbs, gives us an example of applied wisdom, where he tells us what to do in the case of an adulteress or an adulterer. If you missed out on my first video on Proverbs 2, you might want to go back and give that a watch. I'll leave a link down in the description, but if you watch that, you'll have a better understanding of what's being applied here as Solomon goes through this specific example of adultery. Without further ado, let's jump right into it with Proverbs 2, verse 16. Unfortunately, my editing skills are just as bad as my speaking skills, so if you'd like to follow along, I use an ESV Bible, which you can find anywhere on the internet. But let's get started with Proverbs 2, verse 16. Verse 16 says, "So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words." So, right off the bat, Solomon gives us some interesting things to think about here. In the footnotes of my Bible, forbidden is, or what they translate as forbidden, is actually the Hebrew word for strange. So, I don't really think that they mean, oh, she's strange, she's weird woman. No. Instead, when they say strange woman, Solomon means a woman that's strange to the man. He doesn't know her as well as, a man would normally know his wife. She's relatively unknown. And also, adulteress is what the... And also, the word they translate as adulteress is actually the Hebrew word for foreign woman. And more or less, this is the same thing. It's not literally talking about a foreigner, someone from another country. What they're talking about here is a woman that's foreign to the man. Someone who isn't as familiar to the man as a man would be to his wife, if you catch my drift. So, also, some of us, if you're not of a Christian background already, and you may or may not believe in celibacy before marriage, but this might raise a question for you of why would you want to stay away from adultery? An adultery and an adulteress is technically sex with a woman who is not your wife or your husband, but nowadays it's kind of taken the connotation of any kind of sex outside of marriage. So why is Solomon saying that, well, men in particular here, since he's addressing us as my son at the beginning of the chapter, why does he think men should stay away from adulteresses and strange women? Well, there's a lot of scientific data on this, actually, but let's start with our first things first. So I think we should establish that attractive women are, in all seriousness, one of the most desirable things to most men, if not the most desirable. Men are very visual creatures, and more so than women, actually. And we like to see things, women included. That's why men always talk about, oh, what an attractive woman. Whenever they're at the beach or anywhere that you can see attractive women, I guess. And the fact that men are more visual creatures than women is is why pornography has such a large male user base, and why men illogically comment on the pictures of Instagram models, and especially like hyper-sexualized pictures like belfies or butt selfies, saying things like OMG gorgeous with the hard eyes emoji, or so beautiful, even though, that yeah, you know what I'm trying to get at. These men are trying to get laid, whether they realize it or not. They see this woman and they're like, wow, she's really attractive. I want to try and get with her. And, even though it's on Instagram and they have virtually no chance of actually pulling it off, they're driven to try anyway, which just goes to show the power that visual stimuli have over men, especially when it's of scantily clad women. It makes them, or it short circuits their logic systems. The prefrontal cortex, I believe, that's the one that does logic, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. And it makes them, think that they actually have a chance when it's just a person on the internet. And I've seen videos. I think it was Red Pill interviews. One of the questions that he asks, random women on the street is, would they ever, date a man who commented on their pictures like that? And the resounding answer was, no, they would not. More often than not, they find those kind of men creepy. So, sorry, man. Commenting on women's Instagram photos is not the way. So, going back to the original point, sorry for that little tangent there. Oftentimes, beautiful women tend to realize the power that their beauty gives them over men, and they, if they're interested in said man, they'll try to seduce them or get them to do things they normally wouldn't do. Hence the phenomena of quote-unquote sugar daddies and other similarly positioned men. Men that are kind of seduced by a woman into buying her material things. Whether it's actually in exchange for sex or whether it's just with the implicit promise of sex that they may or may not pull through with. It's all the same in any case. But what's bad about being seduced into having sex with a beautiful woman when you aren't married to her? Well, psychologically and chemically speaking, during sex or any kind of sexual precursor as well, I guess most people would call that foreplay, the body releases high amounts of dopamine and oxytocin. Dopamine, while produced by the body, is the key ingredient in developing addictions, actually, because the more dopamine your body releases, the more dopamine it takes to get the same feeling of pleasure. And over time, or perhaps instantly, I'm not sure, the rush of dopamine during sex creates the desire to repeat the actions which led to the dopamine release, i.e., sex in this case. And on top of the desire to have more sex, oxytocin is the chemical which induces feelings of attachment to another person, particularly, but it could be, I'm not sure. You probably release oxytocin when you see your dog or your cat. Or if you're a very young child, your blankie, something that you feel a strong emotional attachment to. So thus, more specifically than just having more sex, one ends up desiring more sex with that same person, which in turn increases the attachment, etc. So in all, this never-ending loop serves to hold relationships together, which is ultimately why one would choose not to engage in the kind of premarital or extramarital sex Solomon describes here. Because, if you haven't, caught on, the emotional bond that develops from sex is the strongest bond between humans there is. And to my knowledge, the you know, sorry, it's the strongest bond between humans that there is, to my knowledge. The relationship may end afterwards, but the emotional bond remains for years and years afterwards. And unfortunately, I kind of speak from experience on this. And, while it was pleasurable in the moment, I don't think anything really brings me as much pain as the connection that's still there between, the woman I had sex with and myself. You know, Even 2 years later now, it's always there. In any case, it's really quite astounding to me how succinct, Solomon fits all of that experience and wisdom into a single sentence. And that was only the first verse of 4 that I'm talking about here. So let's read verse 17 here, if I flip back to it, because it's windy, blew in my pages open. Verse 17 reads, "Who forsakes the companion of her youth, and forgets the covenant of her God." And again, this is talking about the adulteress. So, when Solomon says, "forsaking the companion of her youth and forgetting the covenant of her God," he could be referring to a number of things. It could be a reference to, women in the biblical age typically getting married at a young age, like, in the 10 to 15 range, or feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my general understanding of it. Hence, the companion of her youth, which would be her husband whom she married when she was young. Or, this could be also a reference to her literal youth as being her companion. And by youth, they mean her innocence or her virginity or something along those lines. And as for forgetting the covenant of God, this is a reference back to Exodus and Deuteronomy, which contain the Ten Commandments, sometimes called the Decalogue. And one of those 10 Commandments is that thou shalt not commit adultery. Though no reason is given here in Exodus or Deuteronomy, it's likely that God / the order of the universe, as I talked about being a representation of God in my last video, the order of the universe commands this or makes it one of its rules of order for the very reasons I discussed earlier. Which is that, when you aren't in a committed relationship that can't be broken, an unbreakable emotional bond, such as that created during sex, can actually really hurt you. And people nowadays try to make out sex to be this emotionless thing or something that you should, have no strings attached. Or, let's see, what's that Jonas Brothers song? I believe it's Sucker, and the lyric goes, "Don't complicate it." And, while he doesn't say it, what it's obvious that he's implying there is that you shouldn't complicate, the relationship with actual feelings. And, I'm just going to say it straight up. That's probably bullshit. Well, in fact, I'm going to say that it straight up is bullshit. Because, that's what relationships are built on. So, in any case, sorry, I was on a roll, and then I accidentally pressed down on the wrong part of my notes here, and it paused the video, so I gotta get my spot back. Oh, here we go. Verse 18. I think I've exhausted everything about verse 17. Go. Verse 18. "For her house sinks down to death, and her paths to the departed." In the footnotes here, my Bible says that what they translated as the departed is actually Hebrew for to the refraining, and I don't pretend that I can speak Hebrew, but that's what I'm going to say, or that's how I'm going to pronounce it. And after a quick Google search, it reveals that the refraining are um, a race of giants from Iron Age Israel, and the point is that they are dead. All of them are dead. And if we check out some other translations here, let's see, we have the NIV version, New International Version. Surely her house leads down to death, and her paths to the spirits of the dead. The New Living Translation. Entering her house leads to death. It is the road to the grave. There's another one. The Good News Translation. If you go to her house, you are traveling the road to death. To go there is to approach the world of the dead. So, you know, these are all kind of pointing towards the same thing, and that is that adultery leads to death. Particularly, if you're talking about Christian theology, it would be unrepented adultery. But more specifically than just the spiritual death of Christian theology, there's also a kind of emotional death that I, mentioned earlier, the pain of that unbreakable bond that's always there, even after the relationship is gone. And that in itself does feel a bit like the death of a part of me, because, the Bible talks about, when two people get married, they become one flesh through the act of sex. And when you become one, which is a reference to that intense emotional bond, and then the other person is no longer there, this is not the same as this, and you can feel the difference. It feels like there's something missing from your soul, I suppose, would be the best way to put it. But if you're one of the kind of people that's not inclined to believe in the soul, which fair enough. It's it's like the part of you that makes you human. So part of what makes you human feels like it's missing. So there's that. What else could he mean that's philosophical by "for her house sinks down to death, and her paths to the departed"? Well, if I take out my notes for once, this video, um, it could be referring to the fact, that when women cheat on their husbands, since he's talking about adulteresses here, but it works both ways. Um, the family unit falls apart. As I think it was there's a version that talks about she has forgotten the doorposts of her house and the steps of her paths. That's the Aramaic Bible in plain English. By she has forgotten the doorposts of her house. What that means is that she has invited another man into her house, into her family, that supposedly no one else knows about. And when you know marriages or relationships where one of the spouses is cheating don't tend to last very long, because now, whereas the husband and wife used to be like this, and I don't have a third hand to show this, but there's yet another partner in that relationship that only one of the people knows about. And whether it's the husband or the wife, they now have to divide their attention and that emotional connection and their affections two different ways. And I don't know if you've ever experienced that or done it yourself or anything like that, but I imagine that it's quite difficult. And since your attention is now divided in that way, it makes sense that the relationship would fall apart because you can't give everything you have to that one person to make sure the relationship sticks. You've also created yet another unbreakable bond with someone else, and in the same way, you have to share that unbreakable bond. And how do you choose between this unbreakable bond and this unbreakable bond? If you had to make a choice, well, more often than not, I imagine that the choice is made for you when your spouse finds out about it, whether that's through divorce or you know other means. I don't really know what they would be, but yeah. Solomon could also be referring to women's decreased ability to pair bond in general, outside of marriage, but in regard to relationships generally, as their sex partner count increases. Um, and this is also a scientifically observed phenomena where, as women's notch count increases, they their ability to pair bond with their future husband uh, decreases because they have created and broken that emotional bond so many times that it's almost like they're desensitized to the creation of that bond. Um, and also, it could just be that the type of women who are more willing to have sex with more than one man and men outside of marriage are also the same type of women to have or to not be well suited for marriage, I suppose I could say. But, that's just speculation and not true philosophy, I should say. But, yeah, so that's more or less the message of verse 18. So let's move on to verse 19, where um, Solomon brings the example to a close of the adulteress. It says, "None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life." This translation is a little bit ambiguous as to whether those who go to her come back to her again or whether they come back to God. But there are other translations here, if I can pull it up real quick. Uh, the New International Version says, "None who go to her return or attain the paths of life." The New Living Translation says, "The man who visits her is doomed. He will never reach the paths of life." Um, let's see, there's the Contemporary English Version, "Visit her and you will never find the road to life again." So, the general message of this verse seems to be that people who succumb to adultery find it very difficult to repent of their sins, whether that be, because they enjoy having sex too much, or whether they enjoy having sex too much to feel bad about it, or to feel like they've done anything wrong. That isn't something that I've come up with anything concrete on, but if you have any thoughts, please let me know in the comments down below. Um, but, the main point is, nor do they regain the paths of life, as in, nor do they reestablish their order with regards to the proper manner in which sex should be engaged in, as according to that order of the universe, um, the order that governs the universe. Because they've discovered a pleasure that's unlike anything else. And so, you know, with that, Solomon, well, in Christian theology, that would be kind of like the exclamation mark behind this example, because obviously the point of Christian theology is to, love God, repent your sins, and after you die, go to heaven. But to the non-Christian, I suppose that this would mean more something along what I was talking about earlier with how when you commit adultery or when you have sex outside of marriage, you have that unbreakable bond. And when it is broken, as most times it probably would be, um, you feel a little dead. You feel a little dead, and a little bit broken. And so, if that's not enough to persuade you to not engage in premarital sex or extramarital sex, um, best of luck to you. But the chapter doesn't stop there. It goes on, verse 20. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. Here, Solomon is reinforcing the need to follow the path of wisdom and order, having just, given the particular example of adultery, which, may or may not be the most important example, at least for men, given all the reasons that I mentioned earlier in the video. And, he goes on in verse 21 and 22 to state the benefits of following this wisdom. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. Verse 21, for the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it, is like the positive motivation of, following this wisdom. With the land, end quote, likely referring to heaven, as this is the Bible, but in a non-religious sense, you could imagine heaven to be something like the world of only the best possible actions, a place where only wise choices can be made. In such a place, it stands to reason that one's condition in relation to that of others would always be increasing, always improving, as every person only ever makes the wisest or the best decision possible. Additionally, quote, those of integrity will remain in it, end quote, as Solomon says. And, what is integrity? It's doing the right, or in this case, wise, thing, even when no one will know what you chose. So as to why this is, by that I mean why those of integrity will remain in this land, it's a question, or it's like the question of when a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, will it make a sound? Maybe or maybe not, but either way, the first person to stumble upon said fallen tree will see a tree broken and laying on the ground. Verse 22 provides the negative motivation to live by wisdom. It says, the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. In the exact opposite way, those who live in it are secure inside this land of only the best possible choices. Someone who makes unwise decisions can't logically inhabit a place where only wise decisions can be made. It looks like that's the end of my notes. So, as a quick summary, in summary, men and women should avoid premarital and extramarital sex because it leads to an emotional bond that is unbreakable, or at least incredibly difficult to break, and will only lead to pain in the long run. As Solomon says, doing good things and the best things leads to a better world, whereas doing unwise things leads to a bad world. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Kernel's in, Kernel's out.